Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's Resideo webinar session. We are excited to be providing an overview of our forced air zoning solutions. My name is Jamie Quanbrud, and I'm part of the Resideo Sales Training Team. And on behalf of all of us, I'd like to welcome you to our training session today. Before we get started with our technical overview, I'm going to cover just a few administrative items. Make sure you join us each month as we provide you with 2 opportunities to learn about our Resideo products. Please visit resideo.com/webinars for more information on these sessions. In the month of June, we are featuring 2 zoning trainings, and this is as a result of your requests. So if you'd like to see us provide training on a particular topic, go ahead and send us a note, and we'd be happy to create those trainings and provide that information to you. You can also find recorded versions of our trainings on this same website underneath that webinar recordings tab if you are ever unable to attend any of our live sessions. And on the next slide here, for those contractors who are joining us for today's live session, and you are interested in earning 1 NATE continuing education credit, there are just a few things to note. If you provided your NATE ID on your registration form, we submit that information to NATE for your attendance of today's live session, and we won't need any additional information from you at this time. If you did not provide us with your NATE ID on the registration form for this training session, and you'd like to receive credit for attending our live webinar, we do ask that you send an email with your first name, your last name, your NATE ID, and the date of the session that you attended to homes.university@resideo.com within 1 week from today. This information is submitted to NATE 1 week following the close of each live training session, and any requests that are sent outside of 1 week from our live trainings cannot be processed. As a reminder, we can only process requests for NATE credits when you attend the live webinar sessions, and we are unable to process requests for watching a recorded version of these sessions. If you'd like more information about the NATE program, please visit their website at www.natex.org. And then one quick note just before we begin our technical overview, all of our attendees are muted. However, if at any point during the technical presentation you'd like to ask a question, please go ahead and use that Q&A feature that's found in your Zoom webinar controls. We are reserving the last few minutes of our time together today to answer any questions that come through. So as we progress through our technical overview today, make sure to ask any question in that Q&A feature so that we can address it at the end of today's session. Now we're going to turn things over to Rod McKinnon, who's part of our Resideo sales team out on the East Coast. Rod is a zoning expert. He's going to share his knowledge of our zoning portfolio with all of us today. So Rod, we're going to turn things over to you.
Thank you so much. We appreciate your time today, and we're going to work very, very hard to make it a good investment. So what I want to show you is an overview of what we offer you in the products zoning boards as well as our zoning dampers. So what you will notice right off that you may appreciate is the way that Honeywell Home Resideo has incorporated some logic into their part numbers. So what you see is basically Honeywell Home zoning. The next numeral tells you the total of zones capable in the panel, and then the following red numeral lets you know the stages of heating and the stages of cooling. So this will help you determine the attributes of the panels themselves, but we'll get into that just a little bit more a few slides from now. Now, if you were to pull some homeowners aside and say, hey, how do you like this new house of yours that you may have paid a huge amount of money for? And what's the main problem that you have with the house? Oftentimes, you'll find that the rooms are not evenly heated and cooled. So this is a situation that proper zoning will address. Now, this is a picture of exposed ductwork, and we don't see that much of this in the South because we don't have that many dry basements. But I want you to keep this particular slide in mind because we have an extremely good product for addressing that, and that's called our Rrd Damper. But we'll talk about that a little bit more once we get into the dampers in this discussion today. Okay, so here we have a two-story house with a basement. And so often, depending on when it was built and what the codes were at the time that it was built, they'll typically just go ahead and put the thermostat on the main floor. And so as everyone on this call knows, heat rises. And in addition to the heat naturally rising up the staircase, I can tell you from personal experience that the heat in the attic, depending on how much insulation you have in your ceiling, can add an element of radiant heat to your upstairs, which can make it extra uncomfortable up there. So what we offer you is an easy way to put a second thermostat on the second floor so that we can have a better control of the temperatures in a two-story house. Okay, so when you're deciding where to place these particular thermostats, it's important to keep a number of factors in mind. You need to think about what's going on during the daytime, what's going on nighttime wise when it comes to the zones, what's upstairs and what's downstairs, and what's going on as far as the loads. I mean, we've got to pay some attention to which way the house is facing when it comes to northwest, whether it has a southern exposure on a lot of sunlit glass, things like that. You also want to pay special attention to rooms that are above a garage. This can present some extra special challenges because depending on whether the garage is heated or not, you can potentially have 3 exterior walls, obviously a hot attic, and potentially a cold floor. So lots of heat loss, heat gain can come from that. It's also a good idea to pay special attention to where the master suite is because you want to take care of the person that's paying the bills to get comfortable to make sure they can get a good night's sleep. So as a rule of thumb, please be very, very careful to avoid small zones because this can create some special headaches. But one of the neatest things that you can incorporate if you have enough money into the job is the use of two-stage equipment. What the two-stage equipment will allow you to do is oftentimes vary the CFM that the blower is delivering. And so this will make the system run incredibly well. So in this particular example, you see a second floor where the bedrooms are located. And then you've got your daytime activities, and especially here in a post-COVID situation, home offices can be a very, very important consideration when it comes to zoning so that we can keep your customers comfortable all times of the day. So one of the things that I want to impress upon you is the fact that when you take advantage of the Honeywell Home brand name, you're dealing with a name that homeowners already know and trust. So you're not having to overcome an obstacle there. You've got to understand that we have worked very hard to be the easiest to install zoning and offer you some really high quality systems at a reasonable price. Now, when we go through the zoning boards, I need for you to understand that we do have some basically some builder type boards that don't allow for any configuration as far as tweaking. And that's the HZ221 as well as the HZ311. But what we'll be showing you today is how, by utilizing the plain language setup of our HZ322 and our HZ432 zoning panels, you can tweak these so that they're extremely well mannered and deliver maximum comfort to your customers. So we give you a way to differentiate yourself from your competitors, and the fact that we're offering you the thermostats, panels, dampers, and complete zoning systems. All of this has the ability to relieve a lot of pressure on you to put in a good system. So the benefits of doing zoning and doing it right is you're going to be able to provide your customers with the temperatures where they are in the house and have it the temperature that they want so that it's comfortable upstairs and downstairs. And this is just a benefit that is extremely well received when it's done correctly. Let's say that perhaps you're dealing with some empty nesters and there's a portion of the house that's no longer being utilized. Well, this, along with some programmable thermostats, allows you to actually save some money with a zoning system. But I want you to please understand that zoning foremost is comfort, not so much as the saving money aspect. Okay, so I know that some of our competitors will use a master thermostat with various sensors, but we are basically going to have a thermostat in the loop at every zone. So we're going to combine that with a zone panel and the respective zone dampers, as well as the bypass damper that will deal with the excessive air that'll come with just a few zones, or a smaller zone is all that is calling. Okay, so just another quick review of what the boards bring to the table. With the 311, this is our basic one heat, one cool board with a grand total of 3 zones. Now, the thing about the HZ221 is it's actually a board that's designed to work with heat pumps. So please understand that don't get it confused and get it out to a job site where you have a furnace and an AC. Otherwise, it might be another trip back to the wholesaler. Now, the HZ322 is going to, as you will see, give you a maximum of 3 zones with the capability of 2 stages of heat, 2 stages of cooling, and you will see it'll handle a single stage compressor heat pump. And the top of the heap is the HZ432, which is obviously going to give you a capability of 4 zones with 3 stages of heat and 2 stages of cooling. Okay, so let's talk about some of the features that we're very proud of in general that make our zoning boards very, very easy to work with. And so it's the push pin terminals. So basically, when you push in on the terminal, it has a split in there so that you're able to actually feed 2 wires under 1 terminal. And in fact, even though we don't like to see you using 20 gauge wire, if you happen to put an 18 gauge under one side of the terminal and a 20 gauge under the other side of the terminal, it will bite down on both of them and give you a good solid electrical circuit. Now, when it comes to understanding what the board is doing so that you're taking the guesswork out of it, the LEDs that appear right here to let you know what stage of heating, what stage of cooling, if you're dealing with a heat pump, whether you have emergency heat coming into play, by the green lights and the red lights beside the various zones, you'll also know whether which zones are calling. So this is going to help you in assessing if the dampers are opening properly, if the thermostats are configured properly, and those sort of things. Now, since we know Murphy's Law is a factor in our industry, we have a thermal fuse protection on each zone. And why that's so significant is so that if you overload it with too many dampers by not taking the time to read the installation operation manual, or heaven forbid, if the new homeowner is driving a nail through your thermostat wire, the thermal circuit breaker will open up to prevent any damage to the zoning panel, but it'll still allow the zoning panel to operate just that one zone. It's going to be out of commission until you address it. I tend to be on the geeky side, so one of the things that I appreciate so much in our panels is the fact that it's given you a very, very convenient place to place your probe to determine if the voltage is where it needs to be, not only from your control circuit, but also on the equipment side of the panel. So keep that in mind also, as far as just an easy way to troubleshoot our panels if they need to be done. Okay, so one of the things that we've incorporated into our panels is something that's called a Dsbk Terminal. And we'll be talking about that in a greater detail on our second installment of the zoning training, which will be coming up on the 22nd of this month. And so that Dsbk Terminal works in a fantastic way with a variable speed blower motor because part of what it's capable of doing, it is capable of telling the air handler or the furnace, we're going to tell it a little white line, say, hey, we're in the dehumidification mode. And so this is going to slow the blower down when you have only one zone calling. So therefore, we're going to have quieter air sounds at the registers coming out of that single zone. And we're going to be bypassing less air. So this means that we're going to have the benefit of a more efficient system when that's happening. And soon as we have two zones or more calling, then the blower motor is going to ramp up to the full CFM that's proper for the tonnage of air conditioning that's on that particular system. Now, also trying to give you plenty of options when it comes to mounting it. So, hey, if you're in an attic and you've got a 2x4, well, you'll just use the center two holes for a sturdy mounting. But obviously, if you're in sheetrock, we're going to give you 4 points in order to give a good solid mounting on a sheetrock type surface. One of the things that the engineers have done for you when they were designing this panel is they've given you all sorts of ways to route the wire. So not only do you have the ability to come in from the top, to come in from the bottom, but you also, when you come in from the sides, if you need to go behind the panel to get to the other side and have it look neat, you have the ability to do that. These areas right here are where you can utilize wire ties in order to keep your wires in place. And once again, keeping it all neat looking and concise. Okay, so when it comes to the zoning kits, we're going to give you not only the panel, but the standalone transformer that's always a good idea to use, and very, very important, the discharge air temperature sensor. So please keep that in mind. You'll be just simply adding the thermostats, the zone dampers, and the bypass in order to achieve a good system. Now, it's important to understand that we use very high quality materials. I mentioned to you earlier about the circuit breaker protection and the way that it's so easy to troubleshoot. And as you can see, this particular panel here had a horrifically bad day. Ours are made to handle very, very hot attics. And so we can easily go up to temperatures at 160 degrees, but this one obviously got exposed to more than that. But believe it or not, this one was still operating. So when they say looks can be deceiving, it applies to even zoning panels sometimes. So we're going to give you plenty of options when it comes to using the thermostats also. So one of my favorite thermostats is the 8000 series. It's got tremendous attributes to it, but I also love the color screen the Prestige IAQ delivers. And so that's what's in my own personal house. A non-connected thermostats, obviously, are some of your options, as well as our Wi-Fi T6 series. But please, please, whatever you do, be very, very careful not to use a power stealing thermostat with our zone panel, or otherwise you will have a bad day guaranteed. So please keep that in mind. Now, we're going to encourage you to use a standalone transformer so that we're not burdening the HVAC system transformer. And so here's a rule of thumb when it comes to putting dampers, the ARD or the ZD dampers on one of our panels. With a 40 VA, we're going to be maxed out at 4 dampers per zone and a grand total of 5 per panel. But if you bump it up to a 75 VA, you still can only go with 4 dampers per zone on the ARD and the ZD dampers, but now you have the leverage to go up to 11 dampers for the entire panel. I mentioned to you earlier about the Rrd zone damper, and it's a drive open and a drive close damper. And as you can see, it uses considerably less VA. So you're able to go up to 12 per zone and 12 per panel with a 40 VA, and then 12 and 27 respectively with a 75 VA. Okay, so we're going to look at that heat pump panel that is the 221. As we mentioned earlier, that first 2 indicates 2 zones, 2 stages of heat and 1 stages of cooling. So keep in mind, the compressor is going to be your first stage of heat, with the auxiliary heat being the second stage of heat. It does have the variable speed control for your blower on that Dsbk terminal, but please understand that you're stuck with fixed limits of 45 degrees and 120 degrees. So we'll talk a little bit later of why having the flexibility that our other panels give you is an advantage. Okay, and so for our basic 1 heat, 1 cool for gas or oil furnaces with AC systems, 3 zones, 311. You've got the push terminals, but please, once again, remember that you've got fixed limits that you're going to have to contend with on that particular panel. Now we're getting to the panels that are near and dear to my heart, because this particular one's able to take advantage of that 2-stage equipment that I was twisting your arm about. So if you have the ability to put a 2-stage furnace and a 2-stage air conditioner on there, this panel will accommodate that. But please remember, with heat pumps, 1 stage of compressor heat and the strip heat. If I had $1 for every time somebody tried to use this particular panel on a 3 heat, 2 cool heat pump, I'd feel like I'd won the lottery, okay? Now, one of the things that you're going to see on this panel is you're going to see these A, B, C, D terminals over here, so that when you use that with one of our RedLink wireless adapters, we have a wireless outdoor temperature sensor that will allow you to lock out the strip heat, which is important to us here in North Carolina and a few other states throughout the union. So kind of keep that in control in the back of your mind. So the other thing that's so nice about this particular panel is when you go in to configure it, it's asking you normal, easy to understand questions here. So if you only put in zoning occasionally, this is going to be such a benefit to you so that you can clear out some cobwebs as far as getting this thing configured right. Now, I teach a lot of training schools, and one of the most important things that's often skipped by our industry is the checkout mode. Please, please, after you've got the equipment wired up, after you've got the thermostats configured and wired, take it through the checkout mode. Check out the first stage heating, the second stage heating, the first stage cooling, and if there's a second stage cooling, the auxiliary heat, if you're dealing with a heat pump, the emergency heat. Think of it this way. You wouldn't go to a parking lot and buy an automobile dealership and buy a car and crank it up and say, wow, it idles really good. No, you take it for a test drive. So the test drive on this zoning panel that you can utilize through this checkout mode is going to be probably the most important 10 minutes that you'll spend before you leave the job. Okay, when it comes to the 432 zoning panel, obviously it's going to allow you to work with a two-stage gas furnace, two-stage air conditioner, and the two-stage compressor heat pump. So the 2 stages of compressor heat plus the strip heat, that's what you need that 3 heat for. Obviously, 4 zones. The dual fuel gets to be a very popular attribute if you have, especially if you have access to natural gas. So you let the heat pump do the heating down to the balance point, and when it gets extra cold, then you let the natural gas or oil furnace kick in and give you some nice warm heat below the balance point. The other thing about this panel is it also has that RedLink capabilities. If you add a wireless adapter to the ABCD terminals, this is where it can receive information on what the outdoor temperature is for the proper balance point on dual fuel, or to lock out strip heat to stay within codes that you may be facing. Okay, so I'm going to highly encourage you to buy our kits from us that are going to have this just discharge air temperature sensor. It's going to help keep the system from going into a coil freezing up or a high temperature lockout. So, as I mentioned to you earlier, these are adjustable on our 322 and our 432 panels, and we suggest you setting it about 15 degrees below the equipment high limit. So I think that many of the OEMs have a 160-degree limit in their blower compartments of their furnaces. So we would obviously be encouraging you to set the high limit at 145 degrees so that we can keep that furnace from going out in a hard lockout when a small zone's calling and perhaps you're bypassing a lot of air. Because when the furnace will go into a hard lockout approximately 4 or 5 times, now your customer's stuck with no heat until somebody typically trips the circuit breaker to reset the furnace so that it can get back online. This is why having your hands tied with our 311 panel makes it extra prone to perhaps some service calls. But So you're getting significant value with our more expensive zone boards. Okay, so when you're getting ready to put these discharge air temperature sensors in, we're always wanting to get it before the first zone that you run into on the supplier plenum. So if you can put it into the area where it's not going to be picking up perhaps a little bit of radiant heat off the furnace heat exchanger, that's great. But where it's really, really crucial, and I'm going to cover this in just a slide or two, is on heat pumps to get the maximum capability out of a discharge air temperature sensor. I'm going to be asking you to put it between the coil and the blower, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Okay, so here we see a typical gas furnace situation with the cooling coil on top, and we've got the discharge air temperature sensor before the zones. Okay, so for your investment in time today, this could easily, if you deal with heat pumps, be the most important slide in the entire deck. You say, okay, Rod, why is that the case? Well, because this is not in the installation and operation manual. It's a situation when you live in the South and heat pumps are a large part of the business. You learn from experience. So my theme song is Nobody Knows the Troubles I've Seen. So here's what I'm going to be asking you to do. On a traditional heat pump air handler, I'm going to be asking you to locate this after the coil, but before the blower and the strip heat, because not only do we have the additional temperature rise from the electric strip heat when it kicks in on a cold day, but also the potential for radiant heat, causing a nuisance lockout on this sensor when the refrigerant pressures in the outdoor heat pump are nominal and no factor whatsoever of any concern. Now, this is that wireless adapter I was talking to you about that hooks up to the ABCD terminals of the zoning board that allows this 100% battery powered RedLink 8000 thermostat or our battery powered Focus Pro to communicate heat and cool calls to the board. Now on our Prestige, to get that gorgeous color screen that can be any color that you prefer, we do have to have 24 volts to the sub base of it, but please understand it doesn't have to come from the zoning board. It can come from an independent transformer. Now, when you put a RedLink gateway on it, now you have the ability to control all the zones through your smartphone, PC computer, tablet, or iPad. And the outdoor sensor and the portable comfort control can also be some handy items to have to control your zoning systems. Okay, so when it comes to the ARD, that's our round damper. As you can see many sizes to utilize. Now the ZD damper, that's going to be either rectangular or square. One of the most important things that I need to impress upon you is the fact that whatever dimension you give second is where they're going to put the motor. So if you ask for a 20 by 8, well, they're going to put the motor on the 8-inch side. If you order a 8 by 20 damper from your wholesaler, they're going to put the motor on the 20-inch side. So that can be critical depending on the physical attributes of your job. Okay, so here is the Rrd Damper, which we'll talk about in just a few slides. That's the one that works so well cutting into uninsulated metal pipe. And then we'll talk about the MARD, which is for light commercial above 5 tons, and the CPRD. So we'll start with the ARD damper. Round dampers are very popular here in the South, so it's the one that I'm most familiar with. The ZD damper here, both of these are spring open drive closed. So you only need 2 wires. It's non-polarized. So it makes it nice and simple as far as connecting the low voltage wiring. The EARD is a normally closed damper that lets fresh air come into the structure when you need it. In the olden days, you had this type of damper motor on there, but the new and improved one is significant. And I'll show you why on the next slide. It's got many attributes that you're going to really like, that red lever being one of them. But keep in mind that by this damper being spring open, if it's going to fail, it's going to more than likely fail in the open position, which is going to prevent a crisis from cropping up as far as those weekend or late night calls. The ventilation damper is normally closed, and it's got the red label to alert you to the fact that something's up in that respect. Okay, so you see the numbers here, the number 1, 2, and 3. Where this helps you is you can bleed some air into some of the larger zones so that you're not having to bypass so much air. So by taking advantage of the number 1 or number 2 position, you make this a well-mannered damper. Now, even though you have 3 low voltage connections here, you typically are only going to use the M1 and the M6 connection, because what this is going to do is going to drive the damper closed, and it's going to light a red light here when it's completely in the closed position, or one of the pre-selected positions when it's done with its movement. Now, if you break out a little retainer here and run a wire to the M4, then you'll have a green light. So if you like, red and green Christmas lights in your attic, go for it, but it's certainly not necessary. The nice improvement is by having a very short Allen screw here, is it's less likely to get snagged on the insulation or mastic. So that's a nice user installation that makes it very friendly. And we designed it so it's backwards compatible. So when Old Faithful here does eventually die, it's a situation where you can loosen up the Allen screw and replace it with a new motor. And then when you go with the new motors, it's so nice to be able to have an easy indicator of the position of your damper inside the ductwork. That's a significant blessing in that respect. Okay, so now we're up to where you have the non-insulated pipes. And what we're going to do with the Rrd damper is we're going to give you a template. And keep in mind that this is a significant portion of the US market. So by taking the sticky template, you can stick it on the section of a metal pipe and see exactly where you need to cut out and exactly where your screw holes will go in. So you'll be able to put this damper that has the sealer around the edge of it into the ductwork, and then you've got the ability to zone 5, 6, 7, and 8-inch dampers in a system. So it's a really neat thing if your part of the country lends itself to that installation. Now remember, with the MARD, that's for 5 tons and over, and it is a drive open, drive closed, and even though the motor's big, it pulls very, very low VA. Now the CPRD is near and dear to my heart because it is a significant breakthrough when it comes to bypass type dampers. Part of what we do is we color code it so that the red plastic here, you know that you're going to be using, you'll see a red arrow on the regulator if you have multiple sizes at the job site. So basically what we're doing is when some of the smaller zones are calling, we've got to do something with that excess air. And so this is where a bypass damper comes into play. So it's got an arrow on there so that we can get it pointed in the right direction toward the return side of the system. It's got the neat attribute that you can put it at any angle. So that's very significant. And even though this shows the return air being dumped directly into the return air plenum. If you get it further out on the return air ductwork, this will allow for the air to mix and less likely to create issues with your limit, particularly in gas furnaces. Okay, so the 4 sizes available, we've already mentioned. This works really, really well with variable speed air handlers. By not being hindered to try to keep that shaft horizontal like you have to with the old-timey balanced arm with the weight on the end of it, it gives you lots of flexibility. So what you're going to do is you're going to set it up so that all the zones are calling maximum airflow, and you're going to make an adjustment so that it barely closes. The thing that's always seems so funny about the weighted arm is if you sent 4 guys out to a job site to set the weight on the arm, typically you'd have like 5 different configurations. To figure how much bypass air you need, how big a damper it needs to be, air moves through a bypass damper twice as fast as it moves through normal ductwork. So here's the formula. What you do is you take the total CFM of the system. As you see, this is a 5-ton system. We're going to subtract the smallest zone that's only got 600 CFM going to it, and recognize that when that smallest zone is the only zone that's calling, we need to bypass 1400 CFM of air. And so all we're going to need is a 12-inch CPRD to do that. Please don't pull out your ductiolators and figure you're going to do bypass air with a ductilator. That's not the way it works when you've got pushing on the supply air side and negative pressures on the return air. So this is a little handle that's going to flip out. You push it down because it's got a little clutch mechanism. And once again, you're going to have all the zones calling for maximum airflow, typically in the cooling mode. And once you do that, you want to crank up the pressure on this arm so that that damper just barely closes. And so when that takes place, then you go to the smallest zone and see if the sound levels there are acceptable. And if that's the case, then you're pretty much done. And then if it's a little bit on the high side, that's where we can open up some of the larger dampers to the number 1 or 2 position to bleed off some of that air. So that, in a nutshell, is look at our zoning lineup. And so this is where you can find some additional information.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for that overview, Rod. We appreciate you walking us through our zoning portfolio. As Rod mentioned, if you're interested in finding more information about the zoning products and accessories that were covered today, you can find that information on the new Resideo Pro website that is shown here. We are going to transition now into answering some common questions that our sales team gets often about our zoning portfolio. And just as a quick reminder, if you do have questions on anything that was reviewed today, make sure and take a few moments and enter that information into that Q&A feature in your Zoom controls, and we'll do our best to address those questions in the time that we have remaining.
Okay, so one of the questions that we often get is, other than the bypass, what's some of the ways that we can reduce the pressures, therefore the sound of the zone system? And so, like I said, I know I'm plugging my next part 2 of this zoning training, but the Dsbk Terminal has 24 volts coming out of it. And with most OEM pieces of equipment that have variable speed blower motors on them, when you remove the 24 volts, once again, it's typically will slow down to about 65 or 70% of the normal CFM. And so when only one zone's calling, to have that automatically slow down is a big benefit. And then we also mentioned about perhaps bleeding a small amount of air. You saw the 17%, 30% in selection number 2 into some of the larger zones. Typically, this is not noticed temperature-wise, but it takes some of the pressure off the bypass and that amount of air going into a single zone when it's calling. Now, a question when you're doing IEQ in a house that has zoning, a question we often get is, well, can I control a humidifier, dehumidifier, fresh air ventilation with a zone system? And the answer is yes. It's important to understand that many of our thermostats, for example, our new T10, as well as our 8000 Wi-Fi and our 8000 RedLink, have dry contacts on the sub base that are going to let you control various pieces of equipment, be it either a humidifier, dehumidifier, or fresh air ventilator. So when you recognize that our zone dampers are designed to be spring open, well, what this allows you to do is to route the G circuit through a single pole double throw isolation relay. And please note that many of our pieces of equipment have that particular already built into it. And it allows us to send humidified air, dehumidified air, or even fresh air to all the zones of the system in the standby mode, because they're sitting there with the dampers open, totally clueless that we're energizing that G circuit and turning on the blower. So we'll get a little bit more into that for part 2 of the control system on zoning.
Great. All right, it's time to answer the questions that have come in throughout our presentation. So Rod, if you want to move to the next slide. I've got a couple of questions here that have come in. First one is there a specific terminal on the furnace or air handler that connects to the zone board for controlling the variable speed motor?
Yes, it's a situation where most of the manufacturers will call it a dehume terminal, okay? But if I'm not mistaken, both Train and American Standard refer to it as a BK terminal. Linux typically refers to it as the DS terminal.
Great. All right, we're going to stick with zoning for just a second here. When only one zone is calling and the fan is running in slow speed, do you have any problems with coil freezing, short cycling the compressor, or heat exchanger short cycling?
I do understand why that question's being asked, but it's been my experience that the fact that we are sending so many BTUs of cooling capacity or heating capacity to a single portion of the house, that we can typically take care of that temperature call quickly enough that that doesn't tend to be a factor.
Okay. And then our last question is actually about our T10 thermostat. Can the T10 talk to the EIM?
No, at this point in time, the RedLink features that are built into the T10 only apply to the wireless indoor sensors. So you've got a rock solid communication between the T10 thermostat that's actually a Wi-Fi thermostat that communicates with the router in the customer's house. But no, at this point in time, to control IEQ functions as well as the equipment functions, we've got to be able to get all the wires to the sub base of our new T10.
And if you have further questions on the T10, we have a webinar saved where we spent a full hour talking about our T10 thermostat, its capabilities, as well as accessories. So please feel free to go out and find that resource for more information. And I think that's all the time we have today, Rod. Thanks so much for walking us through these common questions and for a great training today. Thank you to all of our attendees. We appreciate your engagement with us as we share the details of our zoning solutions. If you do have additional questions, please feel free to reach out to your local Resideo sales rep, or you can always send an email to homes.university@resideo.com and we'll make sure to get your question answered. And we want to make sure that we are sharing the details of our trainings with all of you, as training is something we're very passionate about at Resideo. And we want to make sure that you're aware of all the trainings that we have available to you. And recently we launched our online training catalog where we publish in-depth technical and sales training for all of our customers. And you can access this online training catalog by visiting our training page on that Resideo Pro website. And the first time you access that online training catalog or LMS, you'll be asked to create an account, and going forward, you'll log into your training account to access these trainings. Currently, we've got about 20 online learning modules available, including several modules on our dehumidification portfolio. We also have training modules on our T10 thermostat, as well as our Prestige IAQ thermostat. And these online trainings cover everything from technical and installation details, as well as show you how to identify the right customer and to sell these products to homeowners as well. So we're very excited to add this online training catalog to our training offerings for all of you. So as you have time throughout your week and you're interested in more in-depth trainings, we encourage you to sign up for a Resideo Pro portal account to access these trainings. And if you are a Resideo Pro Perks member, you will also receive training credit when you enroll and take these online training courses as well. Also, on our next slide here, as a reminder, we're going to continue to offer our customer webinar series twice each month. So make sure that you join us for these upcoming training sessions. Visit resideo.com/webinars underneath the HVAC or the plumbing tabs for more information and to sign up for our upcoming sessions. And additionally, we do record each of these sessions, and you can find those recordings on that same website underneath the webinar recordings tab. And then on our next slide here, one last reminder to contractors who did not include your NATE ID on your registration form and you'd like to receive credit for today's session, make sure you send an email with your first name, your last name, your NATE ID number, and the date of the session that you attended to homes.university@resideo.com within 1 week of today's live session in order to receive credit for attending this live training. All right, and two final things to note. Once our training session ends today, you will be prompted to complete a survey regarding our webinar session. Please take a few moments to provide us with your feedback on the training that you participated in. We are very interested in your feedback, not only on the session that you attended, but also your feedback helps us to create future training. So your feedback is important to us. And finally, you are going to receive an email from us in a few days that includes some follow-up information on the new products that are the products that we reviewed today, as well as a link to the website for more information on our future webinars as well. Thank you all for joining us for today's Resideo webinar session. Have a great day, everyone.